there is something to be said for the more pressure you put on your city government, the more you're going to get a result that kind of looks like what you want. But I've really come to the conclusion that these state actors reinforce each other. So at the end of the day, they're going to do what's in their own very myopically defined self-interest, not what's in the interest of the community as a whole. And I say myopically defined because Aristotle, who I guess I didn't bring with me today, one of the things that he talks about is that what is actually in your best interest is also what's in the best interest of the community. You know, if the person next to me is poor and has to steal in order to survive, it's not going to be today, it's not going to be tomorrow, but he's going to steal from me. So I have a selfish, rational self-interest in making sure that my neighbor is somewhat well taken care of in order to meet my rational self-interest. And so I'm against states, and I define states in a very broad way. This definition is unorthodox, and it's also circular. So I understand that there are issues with it, but I think it's also illuminating. I think that a state is an entity with sufficient power to be recognized as a legitimate player by other states. So from that perspective, you know, China is a state. Why? Well, because it has a border and enough power to enforce that border, right? So then it becomes a state. The moment that Google is able to enter into negotiations and actually have a treaty with China, then to me that means that Google is also a state because it has been recognized as having that some kind of sufficient power. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, but states have to have things like geography in order to qualify as a state. And I would argue that the Catholic Church has been a state for a really long time, regardless of how much land it actually has, right? I mean, Vatican City is like this much, right? And it's completely surrounded by Italy. That doesn't mean that the Vatican has less power and less emphasis in the lives of daily people just because they don't have as much land as they did prior to Garibaldi unifying Italy. So I do truly believe that states come into being by exercising power. Okay. Now the question that I'm going to pose to you is the Occupy movement a state? And if it isn't, should it try to become one? And if it is, should it try not to become one? And these are questions that I'm still working on myself. It might turn out that this approach is the wrong approach, but that's why I'm not standing at the podium and sitting in a circle, right? So, even though there might be a lot wrong with this definition, it does illuminate, because the trouble with all of these states is that they came into being through power and violence, but none of them want to admit that they came into being through power and violence, right? They want to say, well, we were democratically elected, and they give you all of these different stories. But ultimately, we have a group of people who is in power, and power is very addictive in the sense that once you have it, you feel like you have to have more and more and more in order to avoid that fear that I was talking about earlier, right? So we have people who have power and yet are afraid, and then we have people who don't have power and are disenfranchised, and so they're afraid. And ultimately, we have a system that is completely based on fear. Why do I obey the laws that I obey? Because I'm scared of going to jail. Not because I agree with them, not because I think that they're in my best interest, but because I know that if I break them, they're going to stick me in this really awful place, right? So that's part of the reason why I also do some work towards prison abolition, because I do think that as long as those structures exist, that really is the embodiment and the codification of that fear.
In some ways though, like law isn't really the basis, like in which I know like in some cases like when I like stop at a light, although like fear is a certain basis, like yeah, like I don't want to get ticketed or have to pay money to a certain space. Like if it's 3 in the morning and I take a look around and like it's just me sitting at a light for 5 minutes wasting my life, like I might just run it. I might take a risk. So like I feel like law isn't an appropriate way to really curb human nature. I don't think, for instance, if we got rid of the law of like if you murder somebody, like that you'll go to jail, that you're gonna see everyone start killing each other. Because I think that like law and some practices, people are the same reason why people broke the law to free people that when they didn't identify with slavery. Like they take chances and they look at risk because they look at the law as maybe a guideline, but then they judge it on their own personal interest, their own personal beliefs, and they make a decision beyond what a state or a government or a business entity is forcing on them. So I think definitely fear is an aspect, but I think it goes much deeper, and like people do question it, and I don't think it's the ultimate reason why people do what they do or don't do certain actions.
Well, I think that people do overcome their fear, right, because they have other things that they want equally. But what I would say, and maybe this is just my own lived experience, that's possible too, but it really does seem that we live in a state almost of perpetual fear when it comes to certain actions. Like when I would ask people, well, why don't you come down to City Hall and come and occupy? Over and over and over again it was, well, I'm afraid of being arrested. I'm afraid of being arrested. I'm afraid of being arrested. Or why don't you go and do this? Well, I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid. Well, why are you afraid? Because we fundamentally live in a system that motivates you by saying, don't do this, or I'm going to fine you, jail you, etc. Right? That's really the only conversation that we have from government most of the time. Very rarely is it the case that government comes along and says, I want to encourage you to doing a certain action. I mean, they do to a certain extent, right, with tax breaks and grant monies and that sort of thing. But I would say that the overwhelming majority of the actions that government is engaged in is to say, don't do that, and then there's this fear behind it. And just give me a moment. The point that I'm trying to make is that this is actually tied into capitalism. There is no way that we could have a nice, fuzzy government that wasn't based on fear and still have an economic system that looks at you and looks at the environment not as something to cooperate, not as I want to gift something to